The pen was almost out of ink. Lyra noticed it scratching across the paper before she noticed anything else about the document in front of her. The pen the lawyer had handed her was dying, leaving thin, pale lines instead of proper marks, and she pressed harder, trying to get the ink to cooperate, while the man across the desk checked his phone under the table like he thought she couldn't see him doing it. She should have read the contract. She knew that. Even as she was signing it, some part of her brain was sending up quiet little flares of warning, the kind you ignore when you're exhausted and desperate, and the heating in your apartment stopped working 3 days ago, and you've been sleeping in your coat. The office was on the 42nd floor of a building that had no name on the outside, just a street number. The elevator had required a keycard she'd been handed in the lobby by a woman who didn't smile and didn't explain anything, just held out the card and waited. The carpet up here was the kind of dark gray that absorbed sound. Everything absorbed sound. Lyra had coughed once on the way in, and it had felt embarrassing, like coughing in a library. The lawyer's name was Mr. Hale. He had the kind of face that was easy to forget while you were still looking at it. "It's a standard residency agreement," he'd said when he slid the folder across the desk. "You'll be provided accommodation, meals, and a monthly stipend of $4,000 for the duration of the arrangement. 6 months, potentially renewable. All we require is your signature on the indicated pages." Lyra had flipped through it. 43 pages. She'd looked at the tabs marked with little sticky arrows pointing to signature lines. There were 11 of them. "Can I take this home and read it tonight?" "The offer expires at 5 p.m. today." He'd glanced at his watch. It's currently 4:41. So she'd signed. All 11 places. With a pen that was barely working, on paper that felt heavier than normal paper, in an office that made no sound, while a lawyer checked his texts. She was 24 years old. She had a fine arts degree that had cost her $68,000 and was currently getting her exactly $0 in return. She had 2 roommates she couldn't stand, and one she liked who was moving out next month. She had a mother in Ohio who called every Sunday and asked carefully neutral questions about how things were going, and Lyra always said fine, fine, things are fine. Things were not fine. So when the job listing had appeared and she still couldn't remember exactly where she'd seen it, whether it was online or on an actual physical board somewhere, the memory was strangely blurry. She'd called the number. The woman who answered had a voice like expensive fabric. She'd asked Lyra 3 questions. Did she live alone or with others? Did she have any chronic illnesses? Was she, in her own assessment, adaptable? Lyra had said mostly alone. No. And yes. 2 days later, she was on the 42nd floor, signing something she hadn't read. Mr. Hale collected the folder after she finished. He squared the pages against the desk, with 2 sharp taps, the way people do when they want to seem efficient. "A car will collect you tomorrow morning at 7. Pack for 6 months. You won't need much, everything will be provided." He stood, which seemed like a signal that she should also stand. "Congratulations, Miss Voss." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. Congratulations on what, exactly? Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. "On your new position." She took the elevator back down alone, stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, and tried to remember if she'd asked what the position actually was. She hadn't. She'd been so focused on the number 4,000 a month, which was more than she'd made in any month since graduation, that she'd simply not asked. Adaptable, she'd told them. Sure, she went home and told her roommate Dana that she was leaving for 6 months for a job. What kind of job? Residency, some kind of live-in arrangement. Dana looked up from her laptop. Like a cult? No, probably not. That's exactly what someone joining a cult would say. Lyra packed that night. 2 suitcases. She put in her good jeans, her worn jeans, books she'd been meaning to read, the small oil painting she'd done of her mother's garden that she kept meaning to hang up and never did. She left her plants with Dana and watered them one last time, and felt a strange swooping feeling in her chest that she told herself was just tiredness. She didn't sleep well. Her apartment made its usual noise as the radiator that pinged at 2 a.m., the couple upstairs with their irregular footsteps. She lay in the dark and thought about 43 pages she hadn't read and 11 places she'd signed her name. At 6:55 the next morning, a black car was waiting outside. The driver didn't say where they were going. Lyra watched the city give way to highway. Highway give way to narrower roads. Narrower roads give way to trees. And then more trees. And then a gate that opened without anyone touching it. And then a house that was not a house. It was enormous. Stone. Old in the way that meant centuries, not decades. Light came from windows that were tall and arched, and somewhere above the roofline, a tower rose into the gray morning sky. Lyra sat in the back of the car with her 2 suitcases and thought, very clearly, I should have read that contract. The car stopped. The door opened. A woman appeared at the top of the stone steps, dressed in black, hair silver, expression unreadable. She looked at Lyra the way you look at something you've been expecting for a long time. Miss Voss. Her accent was old, European in a way that didn't belong to one country. Welcome to Vale Manor. He's been waiting for you. Lyra got out of the car because there was nothing else to do. The cold hit her immediately. This was a different kind of cold than the city. Cleaner, heavier. The kind that came from old stone and old trees and air that hadn't been touched by exhaust fumes or heating vents. She pulled her coat tighter and looked up at the building in front of her. It was worse, up close. Not worse in a bad way, just more. More stone, more height, more windows than any house needed. More of that particular silence that very large old buildings have. The kind of silence that tells you a place has seen a lot and isn't surprised by anything anymore. The woman on the steps hadn't moved. Your bags will be brought up. I can carry them. That won't be necessary. Said with complete certainty, like it had never been up for discussion. Lyra left the bags, walked up the steps. Up close, the woman had eyes the color of old pewter and a stillness about her that felt deliberate, like she was choosing very carefully how much to let show. I'm Marin, the woman said. I manage the household. If you need anything during your stay, you come to me. A pause. Within reason. What's outside reason? Marin looked at her for a moment. You'll learn. Inside was warmer, but not warm exactly. Comfortable in the way that places are when they've been maintained by someone who knows what they're doing. Stone floors with rugs that were probably worth more than Lyra's entire apartment building. Ceilings that arched overhead. Candles in places where most houses would have lamps, though there were lamps too, and they were on. Marin led her down a hallway, without explaining where they were going. Lyra followed, looking at everything. Paintings on the walls, portraits mostly, people in clothing from different centuries, wearing expressions that had one thing in common, a kind of watchful stillness. She stopped in front of one without meaning to. A man, painted in oils, seated in a chair that was almost a throne. Dark hair, pale skin, one hand resting on the chair's arm with a specific kind of deliberate calm that usually meant a person was very used to being looked at and had decided how they wanted to appear. His eyes in the painting were silver. She'd never seen anyone with eyes that color. Assumed it was artistic choice, exaggeration, the painter making him look more dramatic than he really was. That's Aldrich Valecourt, Marin said from ahead, without turning around. Come, Lyra caught up. The owner? Correct. Is he here? Yes. Am I going to meet him today? Tonight, Marin stopped at a door and opened it. A bedroom. Large, with those same arched windows, a bed with dark wood posts, bookshelves along one wall. You'll have time to settle in first. Rest if you need to. Dinner is at 8. Lyra stepped inside. The room smelled of old paper and something else she couldn't name. Not unpleasant, layered, like something that had been accumulating in the air for a long time. Marin, the woman paused in the doorway. The contract I signed, the 43 pages. Can I get a copy? Something shifted in Marin's face. Very small. Mr. Hale's office would have filed it. Can I get a copy here, today? A silence that lasted 2 seconds too long. I'll look into it. She closed the door. Lyra sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out her phone. No signal. She got up and tried different corners of the room. Nothing. She looked out the window at trees so thick they blocked the view beyond, at the gray sky above them. At the gate she couldn't see any more from here. She thought about calling Dana, but couldn't. She thought about the contract. She'd signed on pages 2, 7, 12, 17, 21, 25, 28, 31, 35, 39, and 43. She remembered the page numbers because she'd noticed them as she went. What she hadn't done was actually read the sentences her signature was anchoring. Standard residency agreement, Hale had said. The room was too quiet. She unpacked slowly, putting things in drawers that slid smoothly on wooden runners worn soft by years of use. Hung up her coat, put her books on the nightstand, placed the painting of her mother's garden on the dresser, and looked at it for a while, the bright, simple colors out of place in this room of dark wood and old stone. At 7:45 a knock came. A young woman, maybe 19, with careful eyes and a gray dress. Dinner, Miss Voss. The dining room was not small. A table that could have seated 20 had 2 place settings at one end, which made the other 18 empty chairs feel like they were paying attention. Candles in the center. Food already on plates. Something that smelled extraordinary, which Lyra was hungry enough to appreciate even with her stomach doing its anxious thing. She sat. Waited. He walked in at exactly 8. The painting had been accurate. More accurate than paintings usually were. Dark hair, pale skin, that same particular quality of stillness. He was tall in a way that wasn't just height, something about how he carried himself, like the room rearranged slightly around him when he entered. He was wearing dark clothes, nothing formal, but they fit in that way expensive things did. He sat across the table, looked at her. His eyes were, in fact, silver, Miss Voss. His voice was low, carried traces of an accent she couldn't place something old, something that had passed through too many languages to belong to just one. I understand you signed the agreement yesterday. I did. She picked up her fork, put it down. I didn't read it. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, more like interest. I know. You know? Marin told me. She found it notable. Lyra looked at him directly. What did I agree to? He was quiet for a moment, reached for his glass. Eat first. I'd rather know now. You'd rather not eat? I'd rather know what I signed. He set the glass down, looked at her with those silver eyes that were deeply strange and completely calm. You agreed to remain at Vale Manor for a period of no less than 6 months. During that time you'll reside here, participate in certain household functions, and serve as my formal companion at specific events. A pause. The arrangement is contractually binding. Departure before the term ends would trigger penalty clauses on pages 31 and 35. Lyra's fork was still on the table. What kind of penalty clauses? Financial, primarily, and certain older provisions. Older provisions. Yes, what does that mean? He picked up his fork. Eat, Miss Voss. I'll explain everything, but the food is better warm. She stared at him for another 3 seconds. Then she picked up her fork and ate, because she was genuinely hungry, and because something about the way he said everything told her it was actually going to be a long conversation. His name was Aldrich Valecourt, and he spoke like someone who had a lot of practice choosing words carefully. Not in a dishonest way, more like someone who had learned at some point that imprecision caused problems, and had decided precision was easier in the long run. He ate almost nothing. Lyra noticed that. He'd put food on his fork twice, and both times set it back down, and kept talking. And after a while she realized eating was something he was doing for her benefit, to make the dinner feel normal. She ate. The food really was extraordinary. Some kind of braised meat with something dark and wine forward in the sauce. Vegetables that had been roasted until they were soft and slightly sweet. She was on her second plate before she caught herself and felt briefly embarrassed. But he didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. Vale Manor has been in my family for roughly 400 years, he said. The estate requires a certain level of staffing and social function to maintain its legal standing under old inheritance law. Marin handles the staff. The household functions manage themselves, largely. He paused. What has historically been more difficult to manage is the external requirement. Which is appearances. He said it without apology. There are quarterly events. Formal gatherings with other families who hold estates under the same inheritance framework. At these events, it's expected that the head of the estate be accompanied. He looked at her steadily. I found it difficult to maintain that expectation through conventional means. Lyra set her fork down. Conventional means being? Finding someone willing to attend voluntarily. She looked at him. So you hired someone. I engaged someone through a formal contract, yes. A companion. Correct, 4 appearances. Yes. She picked her fork back up. Turned it in her fingers. Why couldn't you just find a date? Something crossed his face that might have been amusement if it had gone a little further. It's more complicated than that. How? He was quiet for a moment. The candles between them burned without flickering. She'd been noticing that. No drafts in here. Everything's still and controlled. The families involved are traditional. They have specific expectations. The arrangement needs to appear genuine. That requires time, familiarity, a certain credibility that can't be constructed in an evening. So 6 months to seem like a real couple. Not a couple, necessarily a companion. Someone I've chosen to have present. And I'm that person, because I answered an ad and signed something without reading it. The thing that might have been amusement got a fraction closer to the surface. You were selected from several candidates. You were chosen. Based on what? He considered the question like it deserved actual consideration. You were the only candidate who, when asked if you were adaptable, paused before answering. Lyra frowned. I paused for like half a second. Yes, that's why I was chosen. Partly. He finally drank from his glass. You also have no family nearby, no serious commitments that would make a 6-month absence complicated, and according to your interview, you described yourself as someone who was, and I'm quoting from the transcript, pretty good at being in rooms where she doesn't know anyone. That was true. She'd said that. She'd meant it as a self-deprecating comment about being a broke artist who went to gallery openings alone, but apparently it had read differently. What are the penalty clauses? She said. Pages 31 and 35. He set his glass down. 31 covers early departure. If you leave before the term ends without mutual agreement, you forfeit the stipend and are liable for the cost of replacement. Replacement being finding another person. Yes, what does that cost? The agency fee is significant. How significant? A pause. $40,000. Her stomach dropped. And 35? Now he was quiet for longer. The candles still didn't move. Page 35 concerns the older provisions I mentioned. Tell me what that means. He looked at her directly. The silver of his eyes was something she kept returning to. It wasn't the color eyes came in. And yet here it was. Completely real. Slightly unnerving in the way unusual things sometimes were when you were close to them. There's a secondary framework in the contract. It predates the current legal structure. It was included, as it always is, for historical and formal reasons, and in the past it has never been relevant because no one has ever triggered it. What does it say? It says, he spoke carefully, that should the companion depart before the contracted term without grounds recognized by the old provisions, the estate retains a claim. He stopped. A claim on what? On you. The dining room was very quiet. What does that mean? It's largely ceremonial language. Old law. It hasn't been invoked in over 200 years. But it's in the contract I signed. Yes, and it says the estate retains a claim on me. The language is more specific than that. It refers to formal binding. In historical context, it meant that the companion became part of the estate's household in a more permanent sense. Lyra stared at him. Like a servant? Like a member of the family. He said it very neutrally. She pushed her chair back slightly. Not standing, just needing air. You need to explain all of this to me right now. What does your estate actually do? Why do you need someone for appearances? Why does your family have 400-year-old contracts with clauses about formal binding? And what are the other families you mentioned? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he folded his hands on the table, and she noticed, not for the first time, how pale his skin was. Not unhealthy, just not quite the color skin normally was. I'll tell you everything, he said. I always intended to. I wanted you settled first, given a meal, given a night of rest. I don't want a night of rest. I want to know now. All right. He said it simply. No argument. Ask your questions. What are you? He didn't look away. What do you think I am? She looked at the candles that didn't move, at the eyes that were silver, at the food he hadn't eaten. I think you're not something I have a word for yet. That's more accurate than most people get in the first 24 hours. He leaned back slightly in his chair. My family is old, Miss Voss. Old in ways that human genealogy doesn't quite cover. What we are has many names across many cultures, and most of them are wrong in the details while being directionally correct. Say it plainly. He said it plainly. Lyra sat very still. The candles burned, the food cooled. The dining room held its silence. She thought about 43 pages she hadn't read, and the pen that was almost out of ink, and 11 places she'd written her name. Okay, she said finally. He blinked. Just barely. Okay? I need about 10 minutes. Then, I have more questions. She took her 10 minutes in the hallway outside the dining room. She sat on a bench against the wall. There were benches along these corridors, which now struck her as significant, like the house had been designed by someone who understood that people would sometimes need to sit down quickly, and she put her hands on her knees and breathed. Vampire. He'd said the word, and then watched her with those silver eyes that were suddenly making a lot more sense, and she'd said okay, which was genuinely the most absurd response she could have given, and yet it had been the honest one. Not okay as in fine. Okay as in, I have received this information and am now processing it. She was processing it. The hallway was lit by actual candles in iron holders fixed to the stone walls, and they burned with that same unnatural stillness as the ones in the dining room. No drafts. The whole house felt sealed, like the air inside it obeyed different rules. She looked at the paintings on the walls, the people in them across the centuries with their watchful expressions. How many of them were him? How many were his family? How far back did his family go? She went back inside after 9 minutes because she'd said 10, and she meant 10. He was still seated. Hadn't moved, hadn't cleared the plates, hadn't done anything. Just sat in exactly the same position, with exactly the same expression. She sat back down. How old are you? In years as you count them, roughly 800. She'd been ready for something large. Still, 800 was large. The portrait in the hallway, that's you. It was painted in 1687. I was somewhat younger then. A pause. Relatively speaking. The estate. The 400 years. I commissioned the building of it. Yes, and the contract. The 43 pages. That's a real document, with real legal standing, in two frameworks simultaneously, contemporary contract law and the older provisions, which have standing within the network of families who operate under the same structure. Other vampires, other old families, not all are the same as mine, but similar enough that they recognize the same legal architecture. Lyra poured herself more water from the pitcher on the table. Her hands were steady, which she found slightly surprising. The companion arrangement. You've done this before, several times over the years. Always contractual, always with full information provided in advance. He stopped. Mr. Hale's office was instructed to ensure candidates read the document before signing. The time constraint was intended as gentle pressure, not to prevent reading entirely. I'm fast. She drank some water. At other things. Not apparently at contracts. Something moved through his expression. No one has ever signed without reading before. Great, I'm a trailblazer. She set the glass down. So the previous companions. They came, did the 6 months, attended the events, and left. Yes, and the older provisions on page 35. Those never came up. No, because they always stayed the full term. Yes, she looked at him. Am I in danger? He answered without hesitation. No, you're sure. I don't harm people in my care. It's not I'm not that kind of thing. What I am isn't what stories have made it. You don't sleep in a coffin. I have a bedroom. With a bed. Sunlight. Uncomfortable, not fatal. I avoid it. Blood. A pause. A necessity. Managed privately. You won't be involved in that. She absorbed this. The events, the quarterly gatherings with the other families. What do they look like? Formal dinners. Some ceremonies. Social functions that have been occurring in roughly the same form for 300 years. They run late. They can be tedious. He said that last part with a flatness that suggested significant personal experience. Your role would be to attend with me, be introduced as my chosen companion, and conduct yourself with reasonable composure. Reasonable composure, she repeated. I'm a 24-year-old who paints and waits tables. I've never been to a formal dinner. Marin will prepare you. And the old families. They'll accept a human companion. It's precedented. My first formal companion in the 1700s was human. It's not unusual. Your first formal companion. She looked at him. Did you ever have an actual partner? Not a contract arrangement. The question hung in the air. She almost took it back. Once, he said. A long time ago. She didn't push it. The 6 months. What happens after? Assuming I stay the full term. You leave with the full stipend, a bonus for completing the arrangement, and a non-disclosure agreement that you'll have adequate time to read before signing. Funny, it wasn't meant to be. I know. That's what made it funny. She leaned back in her chair. And if I leave early? The 40,000. The 40,000. And page 35. If you left now, in the first days, before the first event, before the formal introduction, it's unlikely the older provisions would be invoked. They require a triggering event. What's the triggering event? He was quiet for a moment. The first formal introduction. Once you've been presented at a gathering as my chosen companion, the old laws consider the arrangement formalized. After that point, early departure would invoke the older provisions. The formal binding. Yes, when's the first gathering? 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks before the thing in the contract she hadn't read became fully, irreversibly activated. She thought about $40,000 she didn't have. She thought about her apartment, with the broken heating, and Dana moving out, and the fine arts degree earning nothing. She thought about this room, this house, this man who was 800 years old and had silver eyes and ate almost nothing and had, as far as she could tell, not lied to her about a single thing since she sat down. I'll stay the 3 weeks, she said. I'll assess before the first gathering. If I decide not to attend, I leave, and you bill me whatever the replacement cost is, and I'll figure out a payment plan." Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly. "That's reasonable. I want a copy of the contract by tomorrow morning. You'll have it. All 43 pages. All 43 pages." She stood up. He stood too, which was a reflex she hadn't expected from someone 800 years old, and somehow that small automatic courtesy unsettled her more than anything else he'd said. "Good night, Mr. Valecourt. Aldrich." He said it simply. "If you're staying, even 3 weeks, Mr. Valecourt is unnecessarily formal." She nodded once. "Good night, Aldrich." She walked out. Down the corridor with the paintings, past the portrait from 1687. She looked at it as she passed. He hadn't changed at all. She went upstairs, found her room, found her bags had been brought up and placed neatly near the wardrobe. She brushed her teeth and changed, and got into the bed, which was, despite everything, extraordinarily comfortable. She lay in the dark and thought, I really should have read that contract. But underneath that thought, quieter and more honest, something else was sitting. Curiosity. The particular kind that was equal parts unsettling and alive, that you got sometimes when something impossible turned out to be real. She fell asleep faster than she expected. The contract arrived at 7 in the morning. Maren placed it outside her door in a cream-colored folder, and Lyra found it when she opened the door to see if anyone was awake yet. The hallway was already lit, candles replaced overnight with fresh ones, the light low and amber. No sounds from anywhere in the house. She took the folder back to bed, propped the pillows behind her, and read all 43 pages. It took an hour and 20 minutes. When she finished, she sat very still for a while, looking at nothing. The first 30 pages were, genuinely, fairly standard. Residency terms, stipend structure, confidentiality clauses, grounds for mutual dissolution, a liability framework that protected both parties, definitions of companion that were formal but not strange. The kind of language a careful lawyer wrote when they wanted something to be both enforceable and defensible. Pages 30 through 42 were different. The language changed, became older somehow, even though it was typed in the same font. Formal in a way that felt translated from something else rather than written originally in English. It talked about chosen companions and estates and the rights and obligations of the old families in language that wasn't quite contemporary and wasn't quite historical, but existed somewhere between, like it had been maintained rather than written. Page 35 said what Aldrich had said it said. Formal binding. Should the companion be formally presented and subsequently depart without grounds recognized under the old provisions, the estate retained claim. The word claim was defined in a subsection. It meant, in specific language that she read 3 times, that the companion became formally recognized as belonging to the estate's household. Not as a servant, as kin. Page 43, where she'd put her last signature, was half text and half something that looked like it might once have been a seal. Circular, old. She hadn't noticed it when she signed because she'd been so focused on finding the signature line. She got dressed and went downstairs. Aldrich was in a room off the main corridor that turned out to be a study. Books everywhere. A desk that was covered in papers that looked like correspondence, handwritten. He was reading something and looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Page 43, she said. The seal. He set down what he was reading. Yes, what is it? A mark of the old families. It's present on all contracts of this kind. It makes the document recognizable within that network as legitimate. It's not just decorative. No. She came into the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, which she suspected was not usually a chair that people sat in, but he didn't say anything about it. Kin, she said. Page 35 says kin. Yes, not servant, not property. Kin, The older laws don't have a category for what we might now call employee. When the provisions were written, belonging to a household meant being part of it. Family in the extended sense. He looked at her steadily. In practice, in the modern context, it would mean you couldn't simply leave. You'd be bound to the estate, and to my protection in a formal sense that the other families would recognize. Forever? A pause. The old provisions don't specify a term the way the contemporary contract does. Lyra looked at him. So if I attend the first gathering and then try to leave, I'm bound to your household indefinitely under laws that a network of old vampire families consider legitimate and enforceable. That is technically accurate. And you were going to tell me this when? Tonight, I had planned to sit with you this evening and go through the specific provisions in detail. I didn't want to present everything in one conversation. He met her eyes. I recognized that was a miscalculation. A miscalculation. She repeated it not angrily, just tasting the word. You knew I hadn't read it. Yes, you could have stopped the signing. I could have. He didn't offer an excuse for not doing so, just said it plainly, which was somehow both worse and more tolerable than if he'd tried to justify it. She looked around the study. Books she couldn't date. Papers and handwriting that belonged to different centuries. A window with the same arched shape as the rest of the house, looking out onto the grounds. And even in morning light, the garden was formal and exact. Hedges trimmed to geometry, paths that went somewhere invisible from here. I want to understand something, she said. The other companions. Over the years, they all knew what they were signing. Yes, it was always explained, and they were fine with the older provisions. They knew they intended to complete the term. The provisions were never relevant. Did any of them ever want to invoke the binding voluntarily? Not by accident, but by choice? He was quiet for a moment. Once, a long time ago. She waited. She chose to stay, not because of the contract. Because she wanted to. His voice was even. Too even. It didn't work out. Lyra thought about the portrait in the hallway again. 1687. She thought about someone who'd chosen to stay, and then hadn't, or couldn't, or something had gone wrong in the way things went wrong with impossible arrangements that had too many centuries of weight behind them. She thought about her apartment, the broken heating, Dana's empty room after next month, the fine arts degree, the number $4,000. She thought about the strange, swooping feeling she'd had when she packed, that she'd called tiredness. The 3 weeks, she said, before the first gathering. I want to use them properly. I want to know what I'm actually agreeing to if I attend, not the contract version, the real version, what it means in practice. All right, that means I ask you questions and you answer them honestly. I've been answering honestly. More honestly. Without the she made a gesture that was supposed to mean careful word choice and diplomatic pacing, and he seemed to understand it. Agreed, he said, and I want to see the rest of the house. All of it. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Most of it. Some areas are private. I understand. The accessible parts. Yes, I can show you. Starting today. He stood. After breakfast. Maren fed her something involving eggs and dark bread and very good coffee, and then Aldrich appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, which surprised Maren visibly, suggesting he didn't often come in there, and they began the tour. The house was larger than it looked from outside, which was saying something because it looked enormous from outside. 3 main floors, plus a basement level, and the tower she'd seen from the car. He took her through all of it, except 2 locked doors on the 3rd floor that he said, simply, were private, and she accepted that. Library first. 2 floors of books, a rolling ladder on a brass rail, reading chairs positioned near the windows for light. The collection was in multiple languages, and she pulled one book out at random, and it was dated 1534, and she put it back very carefully. You can use them, he said, watching her. They're not decorative. I'm worried about the age. They've lasted this long. She pulled out a different one. This one in French, which she read badly. But the illustrations inside were extraordinary botanical. Precise. Something between scientific and artistic. She carried it with her for the rest of the tour, which he didn't comment on. The gallery next, a long room with more portraits, more tapestries, objects in glass cases that ranged from very old coins to things she couldn't identify. He explained some of them without being asked, like he'd given this tour before, which he probably had. Stopped in front of a glass case containing a piece of folded dark fabric. That's from the original structure that stood here before the manor, he said. Nothing remained of it except this. I had the new building constructed around it. She looked at the scrap of fabric. You kept a piece of a demolished building for 400 years. It was a long time before the manor, when there was nothing here but forest and this. He looked at it for a moment. Memory needs anchors sometimes. They kept walking. She thought about that. The grounds outside had a glass house attached to the east wing, and this surprised her. It was warm inside, and growing. Real plants in real soil. Herbs and climbing things, and something flowering that filled the space with a smell so specific and good, she stopped just to breathe it. This was here when I built the manor? No. I added it 2 centuries later. He was standing near the door, not coming fully inside, but she noticed he looked at the plants differently from how he looked at other things. Less like historical objects and more like something he checked on. I find it useful. You garden. A little. Marin manages most of it. She looked at him in the doorway with the warm plant smell light behind her and thought, 800 years old and he grows things. She didn't say it out loud, but he seemed to register something in her expression. What? Nothing, it's just she tried to find the right words. You're different from what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know exactly. Something colder. More frightening. More distant, she said. You're not what the stories describe. The stories were written mostly by people who either feared us or invented us entirely. He turned slightly, looking out at the garden through the glasshouse glass. Neither produces accuracy. They walked back inside, down a corridor she hadn't been in yet, narrower, with lower ceilings, leading to a room that opened into a kind of sitting room she liked, immediately smaller than the others. One window, bookshelves that had clearly been added to over years without any system. A fireplace that was lit with actual wood rather than whatever made the candles burn the way they did. This is where I actually spend time, he said. The formal rooms are for the formal occasions. This is... He didn't finish the sentence. Yours, she said. Yes, she looked at the bookshelves. The books here were more randomly organized than in the library. History and philosophy and fiction all mixed, some papers tucked between volumes. A coffee cup that was clearly left mid-read on the small table beside the main chair. She found that detail disproportionately touching, that an 800-year-old vampire left his coffee cup sitting out when he was between chapters. Can I ask about the person? She sat down on the settee near the fire, the one who chose to stay. He stood by the fireplace, one hand on the mantel. Her name was Clara. How long ago? About 200 years. What happened? He was quiet for a long moment. The fire snapped once. She stayed because she wanted to. She was human, and the old provisions would have made her part of the household in the formal sense. But she was already aging, and I was not. She spent 20 more years here. His voice was measured. She was content, I think. I hope. When she died, he stopped. I closed the arrangement for a long time after that. How long? 60 years. Lyra sat with that. 60 years of closing something off, because losing one person had been too much. She thought about her mother's voice on Sunday phone calls. She thought about how it felt to watch the people you loved move forward in time in ways you couldn't follow. "I'm sorry," she said. Not as a formality, she meant it. He looked at her. "You say that the way people do when they actually mean it." "I do mean it. Most people say it and it sounds like they're filling silence." He turned slightly. "You say it like you've said it about something real." She thought about her best friend from school, who'd gotten sick at 19 and died at 20. Thought about how the loss had changed the shape of things for years afterward. She didn't say any of that. "I've had practice." He looked at her for a moment longer than a glance, but less than a stare. "Then, dinner is at 8 again, if that suits you." She recognized it as a change of subject and let it be one. "It suits me." She went back to her room with the French botanical book and read it badly and happily by the window until the light changed and the grounds below went golden. And then, dark. 3 weeks was both longer and shorter than it sounded. In practice it looked like this: mornings with the contract, then with books from the library, building a working understanding of the old families and the legal architecture she'd stumbled into. Afternoons sometimes with Marin, who was a more complicated person than she first appeared, precise and guarded, but occasionally, briefly, funny in a dry way that surfaced unexpectedly. Evenings with Aldrich, in the small sitting room, mostly. Talking, that last part was the one she hadn't predicted. She'd expected distance. Professional courtesy. The careful management of someone running a transaction. Instead, there were conversations that started at 8 and ended at midnight, and covered ground she hadn't expected his opinion on 19th century political philosophy. Prul, her failed attempt to sell paintings through an online gallery, he asked to see them. The particular loneliness of being very good at something that didn't pay rent, he said, without irony, that he understood. He was a good listener. Not in a passive way, he listened, and then said things that showed he'd actually taken in what she'd said and thought about it, which was rarer than it should have been. She showed him the photographs of her paintings on her phone one evening, sat beside him on the settee, which she'd been doing more often, the chair across being somehow too far for conversation once the fire was lit. He looked through them slowly, not quickly scrolling, actually looking. "This one," he said, stopping on one. "The light source is inconsistent." "I know. I couldn't decide where the sun was supposed to be coming from. It's not a failure. It creates a specific unease, like the scene is slightly wrong in a way you can't identify." She took the phone back. "That's very diplomatic. It's honest. The technique issue is there, but the effect it creates is interesting. You can say it's bad. It's not bad. It's unresolved." He looked at her. "There's a difference. Unresolved means you were reaching for something specific and didn't quite get there. Bad means you weren't reaching." She looked at the painting on her phone. "No one said it quite like that before. What did they say?" "Usually something about potential." She said the word the way you said words that had been used condescendingly often enough to hollow them out. Potential is what people say when they want to encourage you, without committing to a position. "Yes, exactly." She put the phone down. "You studied art?" "At various points." "You study most things over 800 years." He paused. "Though I was more formal about it in the earlier centuries. Later it became less systematic." "What's the strangest thing you've studied?" He thought about it genuinely. "Cartography. 16th century. I was involved in several expeditions, mapping coastlines, before the instruments were reliable. It was partly guesswork presented as certainty, which was both dangerous and fascinating." He paused. "There's something clarifying about doing work where being wrong has immediate consequences, as opposed to painting, where being wrong is just embarrassing, as opposed to many things where error is cushioned enough that you never quite learn from it." She thought about that. She'd been doing that a lot, sitting with things he said for longer than she usually sat with things. You miss the expeditions. Parts of them. The coast of Iberia at dawn. The specific quality of light on open water. Not the scurvy. She laughed. He looked briefly pleased about that, which was a look she'd started cataloging the small expressions that appeared on his face when things went unexpectedly. He kept so much controlled that the uncontrolled parts were visible as contrast. A slight shift of the mouth when she said something he found genuinely amusing. A stillness that became more complete when something moved him and he didn't want it to show. She was paying too much attention to his expressions. She knew that. It was the artist's habit, cataloging visual information. But she also knew it wasn't only that. 2 weeks in, Maren started preparing her for the gathering. It was practical and thorough. She learned what to call the heads of the various old families, learned which houses were aligned with Aldrich's and which were in historical tension, learned that the events were formal in structure but social in practice, that there was as much conversation in corners as ceremony at tables, that the goal was to be composed and present without being aggressive or invisible. They'll test you, Maren said. This was the third session. They were in the formal sitting room with documents spread across the table, family names and houses and centuries of politics summarized in Maren's handwriting, not dramatically. But they'll ask you things designed to assess whether you're credible. Credible as what? As someone Aldrich chose. Deliberately, Maren looked at her. The previous companions were prepared. They knew the history. They could speak to it. A pause. You'll need to be honest about what you know and strategic about what you don't. Meaning, if you don't know something, say so directly. Don't perform knowledge you don't have. These people are old. They can smell it. Literally? Some of them? Yes, Lyra made a note. What's the biggest mistake I could make? Maren thought about it. Appearing afraid. I will be afraid. Yes, but appearing afraid is different from being afraid. She looked at Lyra with those pewter eyes. You've been managing that reasonably well already. It was the closest Maren had come to a compliment. Lyra took it. That evening she found Aldrich in the library, standing on the rolling ladder reaching for something on the upper level. He came down when he heard her, holding a slim, dark volume. The evening gathering, she said, if I attend. Once I'm introduced. What changes? He stood on the last rung of the ladder. In practical terms, nothing immediately. You remain here for the remaining weeks of the contract term. The other families acknowledge the arrangement. He paused. The older provisions activate as discussed. And you. What changes for you? He stepped off the ladder, held the book in both hands. You become formally mine, he said, under the old laws. My chosen companion in a sense that has weight to the network of families. Yours, it's protective, primarily. No other family could approach you, challenge you, or make claim to your presence without going through me. She looked at him. And you, can you make claim to me? I already have, in a sense, by having you here. He met her eyes. But the formal binding is different. It's a responsibility, not a possession. She thought about the word responsibility in the mouth of someone who'd kept a scrap of fabric from a building for more than 400 years, who'd closed an arrangement for 60 years because losing one person had been too much. 7 days, she said, before the gathering. Yes, I need to think. Of course. He held out the book. I thought you might like this. Your French is developing. This one has illustrations. She took it. Their fingers briefly overlapped on the spine. Neither of them moved for a moment longer than necessary. She went to bed that night and lay awake for a while, which was becoming a pattern, thinking about binding and belonging, and what it meant to be claimed by something you hadn't known you were walking into. 5 days before the gathering, she painted. She hadn't brought supplies, not proper ones, but she'd mentioned it to Maren in passing, and 2 days later, a box had appeared in her room, containing exactly what she'd have chosen herself. Which meant either Marin was paying very close attention, or someone had told her what to get. She set up near the window in the glasshouse because the light was best there, and because the smell of the plants was good company. She worked on something small, not an attempt at anything serious. She was too preoccupied for serious just color and shape, and something to do with her hands while her mind worked through what it was working through. Aldrich found her there in the afternoon. He stood in the doorway the way he had before, not coming fully into the warm green space. Looked at the canvas. What is it going to be? I don't know yet. She kept working. Sometimes I start without knowing and find out later. Does that work well? Mostly, sometimes it turns into something unresolved. She heard him come in, which she hadn't expected. The door closed softly behind him, and he stood nearby, not hovering, just present. The plants around them were very alive, very green, the silence between them comfortable in the way it had gotten comfortable over 3 weeks. You've decided, he said. It wasn't exactly a question. She kept painting. What makes you say that? You've been thinking for 3 weeks. Something has settled. She put the brush down and looked at the painting, which was still nothing much. Then she turned to face him. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention he had, the kind that felt like being actually looked at rather than just seen. I want to ask you something directly, she said. All right. Clara. When she stayed, was it because of the contract? A pause. No, the contract could have been dissolved. I offered to dissolve it. She wanted to stay. Because of you. He didn't answer that exactly. We had become important to each other. Over time. And you. How did you feel? He was quiet for a moment. The plants around them breathed their green, silent breath. She was one of the most important people in my life, he said. She still is, in the sense that people remain important regardless of whether they're still present. Do you think about her often? Less than I used to. More than I expected to. Still, he looked at her steadily. Why are you asking? Because I want to know if you're capable of it. Of caring about someone in that way. Not as a contract. Not as a formal arrangement. You want to know if the older provisions are just legal language, or if they mean something to me. I want to know if being formally yours means something, or if it's just enforcement. He held her gaze. It means something. Tell me what. He looked for words, which was something he did the pause before speaking that meant he was being careful, not avoiding. When I say something is mine in the old sense, I mean I'm responsible for it. I mean it matters. I mean that its well-being is something I'm invested in, independent of what I get in return. He paused. With Clara it meant I loved her. In my way. Which is different from how humans love, but isn't lesser. Different how? Longer, more aware of weight. When you've watched things end for as long as I have, attachment becomes something you enter carefully, because you know exactly how much it will cost when it ends. He looked at her. I chose you carefully, not just as a companion for appearances. The glass house was warm and quiet. She looked at him. You could have told me that earlier. I didn't want to complicate the decision. You needed to choose based on your own interests, not based on he gestured. Slightly, whatever this is. Whatever this is, she repeated. 3 weeks of talking. Which was not what previous arrangements involved. Something crossed his face. Marin has noted it. Marin notes everything. Yes, he paused. I find he stopped again. Started over. I haven't talked like this in a long time. To anyone. She thought about 60 years of a closed arrangement. About someone who'd chosen to stay, and then died, and left a silence that had lasted 6 decades. She thought about what it cost to reopen something like that, not the door to an arrangement, but the particular thing that could hurt you. I'm going to attend the gathering, she said. He was very still. Because of the contract. Partly, she picked up the brush again, not to paint, just to have something in her hands, and partly because 3 weeks is apparently enough time for something to feel significant. Significant, he said the word like he was placing it somewhere careful. I know what the formal binding means. I read the whole contract. I'm not going in without information this time. She looked at him. I want to know, going in, that you understand what it means too. That it's not just legal architecture to you. It's not, he said. It hasn't been since he stopped. Since when? Since the first night. When you said you needed 10 minutes and then came back in 9. Something moved through his expression, that barely there thing she'd been watching for weeks. I thought, this one is different. She sat with that. You could have told me. You needed to choose freely. I did choose freely. She held his gaze. I am choosing freely. That's what I'm telling you. The glass house held its warmth around them. He stepped forward and took the brush gently from her hand, not taking it, just lifting it from her fingers and placing it on the ledge beside her. Then he stayed where he was, close, not touching but present in a way that was its own kind of contact. The gathering is in 5 days, he said. Marin will want 2 of them for preparation. Then we have 3. 3 for what? She looked up at him. For whatever this is, before it becomes something formal. He looked at her for a moment. Something settled in his face. Not quite a smile, but the expression that existed just before one, which she'd come to like more than the smile would have been. 3 days, he said. Yes, the gathering was held at a house 2 hours from Vale Manor, larger than Aldrich's, or maybe just louder with the weight of it. They arrived in the same black car that had brought her, except this time, Aldrich was beside her, and she was wearing something Marin had found for her deep wine red, fitted, longer than anything she owned at home. The kind of garment that required you to stand differently just by existing on your body. She'd stood in front of the mirror before leaving and thought, I look like someone who belongs somewhere. She wasn't used to that feeling. In the car, Aldrich had looked at her once, briefly, when she'd finished adjusting the sleeve for the 3rd time. You look like you know what you're doing, he said. I look like I'm pretending to know what I'm doing. Yes, that's the same thing, at this level. The house was lit from within, golden windows in the dark. Cars ahead and behind on the drive, other old families arriving. She could see figures in the windows. Aldrich looked at them with the particular neutrality of someone assessing territory he knew well and didn't entirely trust. The white-haired man near the main entrance, he said, is Casimir, head of one of the eastern houses. He's been in political opposition to my family for about 200 years. He'll be cordial. He'll also be measuring everything you say. What do I do with that? Be honest about what you know, and strategic about what you don't, as Marin said. A pause. And if he asks about your background, tell him plainly. Don't perform what you're not. You're telling me to be myself at a vampire gathering. I'm telling you that performing is legible to people who have been watching humans perform for centuries. Authenticity they're not accustomed to. The car stopped. A door opened. She got out into cold air, and the sound of many people conversations carrying from inside, a low hum of social noise, and stood for a moment, looking up at the house. Aldrich appeared beside her, offered his arm. She took it. His sleeve under her hand was fine wool, cool. She felt the steadiness of him beside her, and thought, right. Here we go. Inside was what the word opulent actually meant, not lavish in a decorative sense, but dense with accumulated history, the kind of rooms that had held important conversations for centuries and had the gravity to prove it. Other guests turned as they entered, some subtly, some not. She kept her chin level and her expression readable, and reminded herself what Marin had said. Be terrified behind your teeth. She was terrified. It was behind her teeth. Casimir was indeed near the main entrance. He was shorter than she'd expected from the description, with white hair and the specific stillness of someone who had been important for a very long time and was accustomed to people being aware of it. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at most things, with patience, and with something underneath the patience that was sharper. "Aldrich," he said, "you've restored the companion arrangement. I have." Aldrich's voice was even. "This is Lyra Voss, my chosen companion." Casimir's gaze moved to her. "Miss Voss. Lord Casimir." She'd practiced the titles. Got that one right. "And what brings you to an arrangement of this kind? Adventure? Economics?" It was a test question. She recognized it, as Marin had said she would. Designed to see if she'd perform something sophisticated or tell the truth. "Both," she said. "Honestly, and I didn't read the contract before I signed it, which tells you either something about my judgment or my desperation, and you can decide which." A beat of silence. Then, something shifted in Casimir's expression, very small, but she saw it. "Surprise. You didn't read it." "No, I read it the morning after. 43 pages. And you're here anyway." "I'm here anyway." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then at Aldrich. "She's interesting," he said. Not warmly, not coldly, like noting a fact. "I know," Aldrich said. They moved through the evening. She talked to 8 people who tested her in various ways, and to 12 who were simply curious, and to 2 who were openly hostile in the polished manner of people who had centuries of practice being hostile politely. She held her ground. Not perfectly, she mistook a house name once and had to correct herself, and there was one moment near the east wall where the conversation went somewhere historical she hadn't covered, and she simply said, "I don't know that period well yet," which caused a silence. But then the woman she was speaking to said more interesting than pretending, and moved on. Aldrich was near her for most of the evening. Not beside her constantly, she could hold her own, and he knew it, and let her but present in that way that felt like a hand on a table, steady and close. Late in the evening, there was a short formal ceremony. She'd been briefed on it. She stood beside Aldrich at the front of the main room while someone spoke in the old language she didn't know yet. Aldrich translated quietly near her ear, his voice low, the words falling soft. "He's saying the arrangement is witnessed, that you've been presented and received." A pause. That the older provisions are now in effect. She felt something shift, not in the room, in herself. Some threshold crossed. She thought about the contract she hadn't read, about the pen scratching its pale lines, about standing outside an office building not knowing what she'd just signed. She thought about 3 weeks of conversations ending at midnight, about a botanical book in French, about a scrap of fabric saved from a demolished building for 400 years. She thought about choosing freely. After the ceremony, they stood in a smaller room off the main hall, briefly alone. She looked at him. He looked at her. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like I've crossed something," she said. "Can't go back over." "No, are you?" She looked at him. "Was this what you wanted? When you put the ad out, found the agency? Was this?" "No," he said honestly. "This is more than what I wanted. What I wanted was manageable. Practical." He paused. "This is not practical." "No, I find I don't mind." She looked at him for a moment. "Formally yours," she said, "under the old laws." "Yes, then formally," she said, "I expect you to hold up your end." "Which end?" "The part where it means something." He was quiet for a second, and then that expression she'd been cataloging for 3 weeks, the one that lived just before a smile arrived fully this time. "It means something," he said. "It has for a while." The party continued around them. Ancient politics and centuries-old alliances and 100 conversations she'd eventually learned to navigate. All of it still new, still foreign, still slightly overwhelming. But she was formally placed in it now. Not by accident, not by a contract she hadn't read. By choice, made with open eyes, made knowing the cost. She took his arm again when they returned to the main room. He covered her hand with his for a moment. Brief, warm in the way cool things could be warm when they meant it. The evening went on. The drive back was quieter than the drive there. Not uncomfortable quiet. The kind that came after something significant had happened, and the words for it hadn't arrived yet. She watched the dark trees pass and thought about the moment during the ceremony when she'd felt the threshold cross. How specific it had been. Like a door closing, but not with the sound of something ending. More like a sound of something beginning, which was not what she'd expected closing to feel like. Aldrich was looking out his window. She watched his reflection in the glass, the planes of his face, the silver eyes catching occasional light from the road. "Casimir," she said. "What did he say to you? At the end?" Aldrich didn't turn from the window. He said your response about not reading the contract was the most honest thing anyone had said at one of these events in 30 years. High bar. He also said I'd either made a very good choice or a very complicated one. What did you say? I said both. She looked at his reflection. You're used to this being purely functional. Yes, does this bother you? That it isn't. He turned from the window then. No, it's he seemed to search for the right word. Unfamiliar, in a way I'd forgotten things could be unfamiliar. He paused. I've been alive for 800 years. Genuinely unfamiliar is rare. She sat with that. 800 years and something could still be new. She found that more comforting than she expected. At the manor, Marin met them in the entrance hall, assessed Lyra with a brief glance that contained something that might have been approval, and asked if they needed anything. They didn't. She disappeared back into the house with that fluid quiet. Lyra stood in the entrance hall with the candles burning around her and looked at the painting of Aldrich from 1687 that she passed every day and had stopped really seeing. She looked at it properly now. The careful hands. The silver eyes. The expression that was guarded in the specific way of someone who was used to being alone in a crowd. When did you have this painted? She said. He stood beside her, looking at it too. After Clara. I hadn't had one done in a long time. She said I should. A reminder of what I looked like when someone looked at me properly. He paused. She said I'd want it eventually. She was right. She was right about most things. He looked at the portrait for a moment. She would have liked you. She had a sharpness about her. She didn't perform things. She said what was true, like her immediate predecessor. He turned to look at her. Yes, exactly like that. She looked at the portrait once more. Young, by his scale, barely 600 when it was painted. She thought about all the years between that canvas and this hallway, all the things that had accumulated in between. The expeditions, the 60 years of closed doors, the centuries of gatherings and politics and careful management of a world most people didn't know existed, and here she was standing in the middle of it, because of a pen that was almost out of ink. I should sleep, she said. The gathering took it out of me. Of course, he didn't move immediately. Lyra, she turned. Thank you, he said, for attending. For all of it. The 3 weeks of conversation. Yes, and the way you handled tonight. And for not performing things. He paused, and for coming back into the dining room after 9 minutes when you said 10. She laughed. You really remember that. I remember everything. For better and worse. He met her eyes. In this case, better. She looked at him for a moment. Then, she crossed the entrance hall and kissed him once, briefly, on the side of his jaw, because she was not quite tall enough for anywhere else, and because it was the kind of thing that could be honest without being a declaration of anything she wasn't ready to declare yet. He went very still, in the way he went still when things moved him. "Good night," she said. "Good night." His voice was lower than usual. She went up the stairs. Behind her, the entrance hall was quiet with candles and centuries. She slept well for the first time since she'd arrived. In the morning, she found the botanical book on the breakfast tray, with a note in his handwriting. The illustration on page 47 reminded me of the glasshouse, a slight factual inaccuracy in the Latin naming, but the image itself is accurate. She opened it to page 47. A climbing plant drawn with extraordinary precision, every leaf distinct, something flowering at the top. She took it to the glasshouse after breakfast and compared it to the actual plant growing against the east wall, and he was right, it was accurate. She sat in the warm green light and turned the pages and thought about what it meant to be bound to something by old laws and older choices, and whether the word bound was even the right one for something you'd walked into clearly, with your eyes open, knowing the shape of it. The provisions said, belonging. Kin, part of the household in a more permanent sense. She had turned those words over and over for 3 weeks looking for what was frightening in them. What she found instead, sitting here, was that belonging could feel like a lot of things. It could feel like a trap, or like an anchor, depending on whether the thing you were bound to was worth the weight of it. She thought it was. That was what the 9 minutes had been telling her. She went back to her room and got out her sketchbook. She'd brought one. It was in the second suitcase, and started drawing from memory. Not the glasshouse, not the manor. His face. The expression before the smile. The particular way he went still when something moved him and he didn't want it to show. She wasn't performing anything. She was just drawing what was true. The weeks after the gathering settled into something new. Not a contract arrangement anymore. Or not only. Something with more texture. Aldrich introduced her to the library's upper level, which she'd thought was purely archival, but turned out to contain his personal collection books he'd read multiple times, annotated in the margins in multiple languages across decades, the handwriting changing slightly over time, as if he'd been a slightly different person each time he returned to a book. She could read the changes if she looked. More careful in the early notes. Less so later, like he'd stopped worrying about the book and started thinking about the ideas. She showed him her sketchbook, not the drawing of him not yet, but the others. Studies from the glass house, quick sketches of the manor's architecture. Marin's profile caught in an unguarded moment at the breakfast table. He looked through them slowly, the same way he'd looked at the phone photographs, but with more stillness. "You draw the way you listen," he said. "What does that mean? You get the thing underneath the surface. The structure." He paused at the sketch of Marin. She'd be horrified. "I know. That's why I haven't shown her." He almost smiled. "There's something here." He pointed to a quality in the line, the economy of it, the way she'd caught the set of Marin's expression with 5 strokes rather than 50. "You're not using your education. You're working from somewhere else. My education taught me theory. This is habit. Habit from what? From paying attention." She took the sketchbook back. "You do it too. You catalog everything. You notice things people don't expect you to notice. 800 years of practice. I've been doing it since I was 12 and didn't have much else." She set the sketchbook down. We learned it from different directions. He looked at her. Yes, she'd been thinking about something for a week and decided to say it. The old provisions. The formal binding. Marin explained what it means in terms of the other families. But I want to know what it means in terms of you. He set down the book he'd been holding. In what sense? Day to day. Functionally, what am I? To you. He was quiet for a moment. Someone I'm responsible for. Someone whose well-being is, he stopped. Tried again. Someone I find I think about considerably. Someone whose absence from a room I notice immediately. That's more than a contract. Yes, I acknowledge that. I mean going forward. Past the 6 months. He looked at her with those silver eyes. The old provisions don't have a term. They don't expire. I know. I read them. Then you know that what you are, going forward, is mine in the full sense of what that means to me, not possession. Responsibility. Priority. He paused. I would like it to be something more than that eventually. I realize that's not something I know, she said. You can't ask for that. It has to grow on its own. Yes, I think it might already be growing, she said. I'm just being honest with you. Something happened in his face. The same quality as the expression before a smile, but deeper, more interior. Like something that had been careful for a very long time, relaxing a single degree. I know, he said quietly. I've been aware of it. And you didn't say anything. You needed to arrive at it without pressure. She looked at him. You're very careful with things you don't want to lose. Yes, he said simply. She thought about Clara. About 60 years of a closed door. About what it cost to open things when you knew exactly how much they could cost. She thought about herself, about all the times she'd not said what was true to avoid making something real enough to lose. I've been doing the same thing, she said. Being careful. I know. I don't want to be careful anymore. He looked at her. The room was very still. What do you want? I want this to be real. Not contract real. Actually real. It already is. For me. Then say so. Not around it. Directly, he held her gaze. You are the most significant person to enter my life in 200 years, he said. His voice was level, which made it more true rather than less. Whatever I'm capable of feeling, which is different from what you're capable of, but not lesser, I feel it. About you. It started before the gathering, and before the formal binding, and before the 3 weeks of conversation. It started when you came back into that dining room after 9 minutes. The room held that. She held it too. That's very direct, she said. You asked for direct. I did. She looked at him. I feel it too. In case that wasn't clear, it was becoming clear, he said. The painting on page 47 was a fairly significant signal. She almost laughed. The note was deliberate. Of course it was deliberate. She crossed the room and sat beside him. He turned slightly toward her. She took his hand, which was cool and steady, and he turned it to hold hers properly. The bond of it, old laws and paper and a pen almost out of ink, felt less like a trap and more like exactly what it had said on page 35. Belonging. In the direction that mattered. The 6 months, she said, when the contract term ends. Yes, I'm not leaving. He was quiet for a moment. His hand tightened slightly on hers. No? No. She looked at the room around them. The books. The fire. The window with its view of the formal garden. And beyond it the trees. And beyond that, whatever the world looked like from 800 years of living in it. I'm not leaving. Spring came to Vale Manor in the slow, deliberate way it came to places that had seen a lot of springs. First the ground, which had been frozen, softened at the edges. Then the glasshouse plants sent out new growth, small and definite. Then one morning Lyra looked out her window, and the formal garden below had something in it she hadn't seen before. Color, low and early, pushing up through the geometric beds in purple and white, the first small insistence that winter had been temporary. She'd been at the manor for 4 months. She thought about that sometimes. Not as a countdown, the countdown had stopped feeling relevant around week 5, but as a measure of what had accumulated. 4 months of mornings in the library, and evenings in the sitting room and conversations that went until the candles burned low. 4 months of learning the old families and the old language she was working through slowly, the grammar strange and the vocabulary stranger, but Aldrich was patient, and Marin was precise, and she was making progress. 4 months of something growing. She was in the glasshouse on a Tuesday morning in early March, when she made up her mind about the sketchbook drawing. The one she'd done from memory, the night after the gathering. She'd looked at it periodically, checking it against the real thing, adjusting her memory of his expression. It was finished now, or as finished as drawings got. She took it out of the sketchbook, carefully, and left it on his desk in the study. No note. She didn't think it needed one. She was back in the glass house an hour later when she heard him in the corridor. She didn't look up from the cutting she was attempting Marin had been teaching her. Cautiously, starting with things that were hard to kill, she heard him stop in the glass house doorway. "This is how I look when something moves me," he said. She kept working. "Yes, you've been sitting with this for a while, since the gathering, and you're showing me now. I was ready now." She looked up. He was holding the drawing with the same care she'd watched him handle the fragment of fabric in the gallery case. "You don't have to keep it if you don't want it. I want it." He looked at her. "I want to show you something in return." He took her down to the basement level, past the archive rooms she'd been through, past the door she hadn't been through, which he unlocked now. Inside was a smaller room than she'd expected. Plain stone walls, no candles, but a lamp in the corner that he turned on, and on the walls, carefully maintained, drawings and paintings. 20, maybe 30 of them. Different media, different periods, different hands. She walked slowly along the walls. They were portraits. Mostly some of places' coastlines she thought might be Iberia, a harbor at dawn, trees she didn't recognize. But mostly people, men and women across the centuries, some clearly formal portraits done by professional hands, others quick, intimate, the kind you did when you loved looking at someone. She stopped at one near the end. Charcoal. Quick. A woman in clothing from 2 centuries back, not looking at the artist, looking at something off to the right, a slight smile. The lines were economic, loving, in the way drawings were when the person doing them couldn't stop looking at the subject. "Clara," she said. "Yes, you drew this." "I did. Much later. From memory." He stood beside her. "I find memory holds things better than I expect." She looked at the drawing, the same economy of line she'd been working toward herself. The thing underneath the surface, the structure. "You understand what I do," she said. "Not just appreciate it, understand it. I've been doing it longer." A pause. "Though differently. You have something I haven't developed, the capacity to draw people you've just met and get something true. You need time. I need time." "Yes," she turned to look at him. "Show me one you did from life." He pointed to the harbor painting. She looked at it more closely. Not professional, not trained, but alive in a specific way that formal training sometimes flattened. The light on the water was right in the way you only got it right when you'd actually been there, actually seen it. "The expedition," she said. "Yes, early morning, before we lost the light." He looked at the painting. "I painted it so I'd remember the specific quality of it. Light like that doesn't repeat exactly." She looked at him. "You've been doing it the same way I have." "Attention," he said. Yes, she thought about the first night, about being asked if she was adaptable and pausing half a second before answering. About what he'd said, the pause had been enough. She thought about what it meant that he'd looked at that pause and seen something true. "The 6 months ends in 2 months," she said. "Yes, I'm going to ask you something and I want a direct answer." "All right. If the old provisions didn't exist, if there was no formal binding, no page 35, nothing to keep me here, would you have wanted me to stay?" He didn't pause. "Yes, for how long?" "As long as you wanted to." He met her eyes. "Without limit." "That's the answer." She turned back to the drawings on the wall. Clara's profile, the harbor at dawn, people across the centuries who had mattered to him in one way or another. She thought about becoming one of them. In the literal sense, she'd already drawn herself into this, already existed in his sketchbook version of events, already been accumulated. In 2 months, she'd be on this wall too, probably, whenever he got around to drawing her. She thought that was all right. She thought it was more than all right. I want to learn to paint properly, she said. Not just draw. Can you teach me? He looked at her. It'll take time. We have time. Longer than 6 months. I know that. She turned to face him. I said I wasn't leaving. I meant it. He looked at her for a moment. That expression she'd learned the one before the smile, deeper now, more certain. Something in him that had been held carefully for a very long time, settling into something that didn't need to be held so carefully anymore. Then yes, he said. I'll teach you. She looked at Clara's drawing one more time, the woman who'd chosen to stay. The 20 years she'd spent here. The grief that had followed her out of this world when she went. The 60 years of closed doors it had cost. She thought about cost and choice, and what you walked into when you signed something without reading it, and ended up somewhere that turned out to be real. She'd signed 11 places on 43 pages with a pen nearly out of ink. She'd agreed to something she hadn't understood. She'd sat in a dining room across from Silver Eyes and said okay when she should have been afraid. None of it felt like a mistake. That was the thing. Even the not reading, even the scratching pale lines of the dying pen, even the elevator and the keycard and the gray carpet, all of it had led here, to this room of drawings on stone walls, to this person standing beside her who had been careful with things for 800 years and was, slowly, learning to be a little less careful. She took his hand. He turned it and held it the way he did now, like it was a habit that had grown quick roots. Outside the manor, the first spring pushed through the frozen ground. Inside, in the warm and the quiet, two people who had come to belonging through very different roads stood in a room full of accumulated care and looked at what they had. It was, she thought, considerably more than what she'd signed up for. She was glad she hadn't read the contract.